Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time to a place where the sun rises like molten gold over the slow, glassy surface of the Nile. The air is already warm, the reeds whispering, and the hum of insects feels ancient, older than any story you've ever heard. You're in Egypt, ancient Egypt, and you're about to spend a day in the company of bakers, farmers, and priests, all devoted to the thing that held their world together: bread. Without it, the pyramids would still be piles of stone waiting for lunch to arrive. You probably wouldn't survive this heat, but don't worry, you're just visiting.
So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching from somewhere across time zones or tucked into your blankets, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where in the world we're all falling asleep together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the eastern bank of the Nile, toes in cool mud. The river stretches out like a silver ribbon, and across the water, palm trees sway in the slow morning breeze. Somewhere nearby, a heron flaps lazily, unbothered by human ambitions. The light is soft, peach-colored, but the day ahead promises heat, dust, and the steady thud of work. You trudge up the narrow embankment path, past a fisherman shaking his nets and muttering something about crocodiles stealing his catch. The smell of smoke hangs low in the air, a sweet, earthy smell that makes your stomach grumble. It's bread baking, ancient Egyptian bread. You wouldn't call it fluffy. It's heavy, dense, sometimes speckled with bits of grit from the millstones. Still, to an Egyptian, this loaf is life itself. In this world, you don't measure wealth in gold, you measure it in grain. Grain feeds workers, pays taxes, fuels armies, and pleases gods. A full granary means safety. An empty one means the kind of trouble even the pharaoh can't charm away. A few children run past, laughing, each carrying a round loaf that looks slightly lopsided, the crust cracked from uneven heat. They bite into it like it's the best thing in the world, which honestly, for them, it probably is. You follow the scent down a dusty lane. Mud brick houses cluster together, their walls the color of baked clay. Women sit in doorways kneading dough in wide bowls, chatting over the squeals of donkeys and the splash of water jars. You notice how rhythmic everything is. The slap of dough, the scrape of a pot, the endless cycle of everyday life. Bread here isn't just food, it's a ritual. Every loaf begins with grain, mostly emmer wheat and barley, grown on the floodplains left behind when the Nile recedes each year. When the waters withdraw, they leave a dark, fertile soil that glitters with mineral life. You can almost feel it between your fingers, damp and cool like wet silk. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians discovered leavened bread accidentally or through deliberate fermentation. Maybe someone left a batch of dough out too long and noticed it puff up in the sun. Maybe it was divine intervention, a culinary miracle blessed by Hathor herself. Either way, that discovery changed everything. From that moment on, bread wasn't just survival, it was transformation. A farmer passes you, leading 2 oxen yoked to a simple plow. He nods politely, but doesn't stop. His eyes are tired, but there's pride there too. Without him, no bread. Without bread, no Egypt. It's the kind of math even the gods respect. You walk further into the village. There's no marketplace like the ones in later centuries, no rows of stalls shouting prices. Instead, there are quiet exchanges. A basket of onions here, a handful of grain there, all recorded by scribes who seem perpetually annoyed by everyone else's poor handwriting. And then you hear it, a low hum, deep and steady. You follow it to a courtyard
where 3 women work around a large oven built of clay. The structure looks like an upside-down pot glowing faintly orange at its base. They're baking flat round loaves shaped like the sun. One woman leans in with a long paddle, pulls out a smoking disc, and flicks it expertly into a wicker basket. You crouch beside them, drawn in by the smell. Warm grain, a faint sweetness, a hint of ash. One woman glances up at you, amused, as if to say, "What? Never seen bread before?" You smile back, pretending you belong, and she laughs softly. There's a story that floats around these villages, that once a baker forgot to offer bread to the household gods before baking, and that night his entire batch turned to stone. The moral? Always feed the unseen before you feed yourself. Whether it's superstition or simple insurance, you can't deny that the Egyptians were serious about their offerings. Every meal began with gratitude to the river, the earth, and the divine order known as Ma'at. As the day warms, the courtyard becomes a whirl of movement. You notice children grinding grain on flat stones, the rhythmic scrape echoing through the air. Their hands are dusty, their forearms streaked white. You realize this isn't just work, it's a rite of passage. Everyone learns how to make bread, just like everyone learns to swim in the Nile or swat away mosquitoes in their sleep. A man strolls by carrying a clay jar filled with something that smells faintly sour. Sourdough starter, you think, though that phrase won't exist for another few thousand years. He pours a little into a bowl of flour, mixes it, and sets it aside to rest. No measuring cups, no timers, just intuition and experience. You can't help but admire that. Nearby, a group of laborers sit in the shade of a palm tree, tearing chunks of bread and dipping them into bowls of something that looks suspiciously like thick beer. Turns out it is beer, more porridge than pint, but it gets the job done. Bread and beer, the twin pillars of Egyptian life. One feeds the body, the other keeps you cheerful enough to keep doing it. You glance toward the river again. Boats drift by, sails catching the light. Somewhere beyond the horizon lies Thebes, and beyond that, Memphis, the great cities where temples rise like mountains of stone. And in every single one of them, in storerooms and kitchens, ovens and offering halls, bread is being baked. There's a quiet reverence in that thought. For thousands of years, every sunrise here has smelled faintly of smoke and grain. The recipe might change, the tools might evolve, but the ritual remains. You feel the warmth of the sun deepen. The air shimmers, and the scent of baking fades as you step toward the fields beyond the village. The land stretches flat and endless, dotted with workers bending low over the soil. In the distance, you can hear the faint clack of wooden shovels and the murmur of songs, slow, rhythmic, and hypnotic. And as you walk, you realize this isn't just the story of bread. It's the story of a civilization learning how to feed itself one grain at a time. The river whispers, the fields glow, and somewhere behind you, another loaf is born from fire. The path leads you out of the village, past the last of the mud brick homes, and into the open, endless fields. The Nile lies behind you now, its slow breath a distant shimmer of blue, and ahead stretches a sea of waving gold. This is Egypt's true treasure, not jewels or tombs or glittering temples, but grain. You trudge along the narrow dikes that divide the fields, your sandals squelching in the damp soil. The smell is thick, earthy, sun-warmed, alive. Each step feels like walking across time itself. The stalks of emmer wheat and barley sway in the morning wind, whispering softly like gossip shared between gods. These fields aren't random patches of farmland. They're living maps of order and precision. The ancient Egyptians were masters of irrigation, transforming the fickle floods of the Nile into predictable bounty.
Every year when the river swelled, it covered the land with a sheet of dark silt, the gift of the Nile, as scribes love to say. Without that flood, there was nothing. No bread, no beer, no civilization.
Historians still argue whether the earliest irrigation systems here were the result of central planning or a slow evolution of small, local networks. Some say visionary leaders commanded the building of canals. Others insist it was just 1,000 farmers with shovels and patience. Either way, it worked. The river's chaos became humanity's rhythm.
You crouch beside a farmer adjusting a sluice gate, a simple plank of wood wedged into a trench. He moves it with care, controlling the trickle that feeds his plot. The water glints like melted bronze under the sunlight. He smiles when he notices you watching, his face creased by years of heat and harvest. The Nile gives, his expression seems to say, but only if you know how to ask. Nearby, an older man sharpens his sickle with a flat stone. The curved blade, made of copper, catches the light. You can imagine the motion later in the season. Hundreds of arms swinging in rhythm, cutting stalk after stalk. Each movement a heartbeat in Egypt's pulse. The harvest is more than just labor, it's ceremony. When the first sheaves are cut, a small offering is often left for Renenutit, the goddess of grain and nourishment. A loaf, a handful of barley, maybe even a drop of beer. After all, you don't want to offend the one responsible for keeping your stomach full. You pause to feel the texture of a wheat head between your fingers, rough, papery, surprisingly light. You can almost hear the hiss of grain rubbing together as a gentle wind sweeps across the field. Somewhere in the distance, a child's voice sings a work song, the melody looping endlessly like the turning of the seasons. A few ibises pick through the stubble, looking for insects. Their long beaks poke the soil with lazy precision. You wonder how many mornings like this have unfolded exactly the same for thousands of years. The scenery barely changes. Even the jokes about the heat are probably the same. Speaking of which, you catch yourself mumbling, "Well, at least there's no gym membership fee for this workout." A nearby farmer glances your way, confused, and goes back to tying sheaves. You grin. Some jokes don't travel through time well. The air grows heavier as the sun climbs higher. Sweat beads on your neck. You pass a group of women spreading harvested stalks on woven mats, shaking them to separate the grain. Each flick of the wrist sends a shimmer of dust into the air. The dust sparkles like gold for a moment before settling into the earth again. Nature's glitter, if you will. They sing as they work, voices blending into the rhythm of the flails striking the stalks. The sound is strangely soothing, almost hypnotic. If you weren't here to help, you might actually fall asleep right there in the field. You watch as a boy scoops the separated grain into baskets. Each one is carried off to a nearby storage pit, where it will be dried and guarded carefully. Not everyone gets to touch the granaries. Those are sacred spaces. In the eyes of the state, grain equals life, and life must be measured, counted, and taxed. A pair of scribes stand under a shade canopy, their reed pens scratching across papyrus scrolls. One calls out numbers while the other nods, dutifully recording every sheaf. You can almost hear the future accountants of the world groan in solidarity. Bureaucracy, truly an ancient art. One scribe pauses to sip from a small water jar and gives you a look that says, "Don't even think about touching the records." You back away slowly. The granaries themselves are marvels of simple engineering, rounded mud brick silos with narrow openings at the top. They keep grain dry, cool, and safe from pests, mostly. You catch sight of a cat lounging nearby, one eye open, watching for the slightest twitch of a mouse. The Egyptians didn't just revere cats because they were cute.
They were pest control with divine branding. A farmer nearby laughs and points at the cat. "That one's more reliable than the guards," he says in a dialect you can almost understand. The cat flicks its tail, smug as a pharaoh on payday. You take shelter in the thin shadow of a date palm. The sweetness of ripe fruit drifts down from above, mingling with the earthy scent of cut grain. You bite into a date. It's sticky, rich, almost caramel-like. You can see why Egyptians often mix dates into their bread dough, adding a hint of luxury to even simple loaves. A scholar centuries later will argue whether emmer wheat or barley made the better bread. Each had its fans. Emmer was nutritious and hearty but hard to mill. Barley was easier to handle but more bitter. Maybe that's why Egyptian bakers experimented so much. Flat loaves, round loaves, conical loaves baked upright in pots. Some were for daily meals, others for the gods. Each had a place in the cycle. By midday, the horizon wavers in the heat. You can see the shimmer of distant fields, more gold than green, each one a fragment of the kingdom's wealth. Farmers work silently, bent over their crops, their movements steady and sure. There's something almost meditative in their persistence. You start to think about how fragile it all is. One bad flood, one swarm of locusts, and the bread supply vanishes. Ancient records talk about years of hunger, grain prices soaring, people bartering jewelry for a few loaves. Yet somehow, Egypt endures. The river always returns, the grain always grows, the ovens always burn again. A light breeze ripples through the barley. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the sound of rustling stalks fill your ears. It's not just noise, it's life whispering through time, reminding you that civilization begins in moments like this: sunlight, patience, and the promise of food. You open your eyes again. The fields glow brighter now, the afternoon sun turning everything to molten amber. A group of farmers gathers near a small shrine, offering a few stalks and a loaf on a stone altar. A child pours a splash of water, an echo of the Nile's eternal gift. For them, it's not superstition, it's gratitude in motion. And as you stand there watching, you realize something profound in its simplicity. In ancient Egypt, bread isn't made in the bakery, it's born here, in the breath of the fields, in the rhythm of the harvest, and in the river's slow heartbeat. You take one last look at the horizon before turning back toward the village, the scent of baking bread already pulling you homeward. The day stretches ahead like an unbroken loaf, golden and waiting to be shared. The air cools a little as you step into the shade of the village again. The sound of the fields fades behind you, replaced by something softer, steadier, the rasp and scrape of stone against stone. It's the sound of flour being born. You follow it, turning down a narrow lane between mud brick walls until you find its source, a small courtyard where two women kneel beside a pair of quern stones. You pause in the doorway, careful not to block the sunlight. The smell of fresh grain dust floats in the air, dry and nutty, and there's a faint sweetness that clings to your tongue. The women work in rhythm, one grinding while the other shifts the crushed flour aside with a flat piece of pottery. It's slow work, aching, repetitive, eternal. You step closer. The querns are simple: a lower stone basin and a smaller handstone pushed back and forth in short strokes. Each motion hums like a heartbeat. The flour collects in a pale mound, flecked with the darker bits of husk. It doesn't look much like the powdery white flour you know. This is ancient flour, coarse, gritty, alive with texture. You could probably use it to exfoliate and bake at the same time. One of the women glances up, her forearms powdered white, her smile gentle but knowing. You can almost hear her thoughts. If you want bread, you earn it, and you believe her. She pushes the handstone forward again, the muscles in her shoulders flexing. It's easy to forget how physical this part of life was. Before the luxury of machines or even water mills, every loaf demanded hours of grinding. For most households, it was women who did this daily, often before sunrise. You imagine the chorus of hundreds of querns working at once, the village alive with soft scraping. Historians still argue whether this constant motion contributed to the skeletal stress patterns found in ancient female remains. The debate sounds grim, but it's true. Grinding grain was so physically demanding that it literally reshaped bones over time. Archaeologists call it miller's elbow. You might call it a prehistoric gym membership. No sign-up fees, just eternal soreness. You crouch to watch the process more closely. The woman working the quern adds a small handful of grain at a time. Too much and the stones jam. Too little and the rhythm breaks. The precision is almost artistic. You notice that the stones are slightly uneven, intentionally rough, to help tear the kernels apart. Every few minutes she pauses to tap the handstone, clearing stuck grain dust with a quick flick. Beside her, a younger girl sifts the finished flour through a reed basket, separating the larger pieces. The fine flour will go to bread for the household. The coarse bits might end up in beer or animal feed. Nothing is wasted here, not a crumb, not a husk. The girl sneezes, sending a puff of flour into the sunlight. It swirls like ghostly mist before settling again. You can't help but smile. It looks oddly magical, like the air itself is baking. A man passes by carrying a basket of grain. He pauses to joke, something about the women working faster when someone's watching. The older woman doesn't even look up. She just grins and says something that makes the others laugh. You don't need to understand the words to get the tone. Some jokes transcend language. You step aside as another woman enters the courtyard carrying a small jar. She pours water over the stones, scrubbing gently with a handful of straw. The mixture forms a muddy paste that smells faintly metallic. Sharpening the stones, you think. They'll dry them in the sun later, so they bite at the grain again. Maintenance. Ancient Egyptian style. You find a shaded corner and sit. The courtyard hums with the rhythm of work, the grinding, the sifting, the low murmur of conversation. A child toddles by holding a small loaf, gnawing on it proudly. And for a moment, you realize you're watching the entire life cycle of bread compressed into one small space. Grain becomes flour, flour becomes dough, dough becomes sustenance. It's easy to romanticize it, but you can see how exhausting it must be. The air is thick with dust. Your throat feels dry just breathing it in. You cough lightly, and one of the women chuckles, handing you a cup of water. You take a sip. It's cool, faintly mineral, drawn straight from a nearby well. You mutter your thanks, and she nods, already turning back to her task. You glance toward the corner of the courtyard and notice something odd, a small clay figurine perched on a ledge. It's roughly shaped like a woman holding a loaf. Offerings like this were common, tokens of gratitude or prayer. Egyptians believed that daily work was sacred in its own way. Every action, from grinding grain to weaving linen, echoed the cosmic order. And yes, there's a story about this too. They say that once, long ago, a careless miller failed to honor the household spirit of the quern. That night, his stones turned to dust, and every loaf he baked crumbled in his hands. Since then, no one forgets to offer a few crumbs to the guardian of the grind. A quaint superstition, but in a world where your next meal depends on good luck and patient hands, you wouldn't risk it either. A donkey brays somewhere outside, breaking the rhythm for a moment. The women pause, stretch their arms, roll their shoulders. The younger girl giggles, mimicking the donkey's noise.
Her mother swats her gently with a smile and goes back to work. You start to notice how time blurs here. The grinding is so repetitive, so steady, that you lose track of minutes. The sound becomes almost hypnotic, a soft, circular whisper. If you close your eyes, it's like the world is breathing in slow, even waves. This must be what ancient meditation felt like, not sitting cross-legged by a lotus pond, but finding calm in routine, in the rhythm of survival. Somewhere across the village, a baker's shout echoes. The ovens are heating. The scent of smoke mixes with the grain dust, a reminder of the next step waiting beyond these walls. You stand, brushing flour from your hands, and look at the small pile of finished flour on the mat. It doesn't seem like much for the effort it took. Maybe enough for a few loaves. Yet multiplied across hundreds of homes, across centuries, this simple act has sustained a civilization. You think about that, how so much of human history rests on ordinary labor like this, invisible but essential. No one will remember these women by name, but every pyramid, every temple feast, every royal banquet exists because someone once knelt beside a stone and kept grinding. As you step toward the doorway again, sunlight spills into the courtyard, and the floating flour dust glows like tiny sparks. You could almost believe the air itself is holy. Before you leave, the older woman calls out to you. She holds up her handstone and gives it a small shake, a wordless invitation. You step forward, kneel, and take hold. It's heavier than it looks. You push it forward once, twice. Your wrists ache immediately. The women laugh softly, amused at your clumsy effort. You grin back, shaking your head. Yeah, you think, definitely skipping arm day tomorrow. Still, there's something satisfying in the motion. The soft scrape, the smell of crushed grain, the tangible result of effort. You begin to understand how this could become a rhythm that shapes lives. As you return the handstone, the woman pats the mound of flour beside her. Tomorrow again, her gesture seems to say, and you nod, even though you'll be long gone, off following the next step of this journey, where the flour meets fire and becomes the heart of every meal. You step back into the sunlight. The courtyard behind you fades into the hum of the village, but the sound of grinding lingers in your mind, steady as breathing. You follow the trail of warm air and the unmistakable scent of smoke until the grinding fades behind you. The narrow street opens into a larger courtyard, busy with voices and motion. The baker's yard. This is the heart of the village, where flour becomes food and food becomes community. You pause at the threshold, taking in the scene. The sunlight glints off the curved edges of clay ovens, their surfaces mottled black with years of use. Each oven is shaped like a small beehive, and the air around them ripples with heat. You can hear the occasional pop of burning wood and the hiss of wet dough hitting hot stone. A group of bakers, mostly men this time, move quickly, bare-armed and dusted white from wrist to elbow. They shape dough with practiced hands, chatting in that half-distracted rhythm of people who've done this 1,000 times. The air is thick with the smell of yeast, smoke, and toasted grain, a combination so ancient and comforting it might just be humanity's original perfume. You edge closer to one of the tables where a baker kneads a mound of dough. It's rougher than modern bread dough, flecked with bits of husk. He sprinkles a pinch of salt from a small clay bowl and adds a drizzle of water. The dough sighs as he presses into it, folding, turning, pressing again. His movements are steady, hypnotic, almost meditative. "Watch," someone says behind you, a younger boy carrying a tray of round loaves. He nods toward another baker who's working near the oven. He can tell when it's ready just by the sound. You look closer. The man claps his hands against the dough. The slap echoes differently depending on the air bubbles trapped inside. You listen. Low, dull thuds at first, then a sharper ring. He nods once, satisfied, and begins shaping the dough into conical molds. It's astonishing. Ancient intuition replacing thermometers and timers. Historians still argue whether these molds, those pointed pottery cones, were used to bake bread upright in embers or simply as supports for shaping. Either way, the result is the same. Small, sturdy loaves, perfect for travel or rations. You can almost see the ancestors of modern pita and flatbreads emerging here in this dusty courtyard. The boy sets his tray near the oven and grins at you. "Wanna try?" his expression seems to say. You raise your eyebrows. Why not? He laughs and hands you a lump of dough. It's warm from fermentation, soft but sticky. You mimic what you've seen. Stretch, fold, pat. Except yours looks more like a defeated pancake than a loaf. The boy snorts. "You'd starve," his grin says. You shrug. "Probably," you think, "but at least I'd go down smelling like fresh bread." A few of the bakers glance over, amused, and one calls out a joke you don't quite catch but definitely recognize as good-natured teasing. You leave your sad little loaf on the table. It might make a decent paperweight, and wander closer to the ovens. Each oven burns with a glowing orange heart. The heat hits you like a wall, dry and intense. A baker uses a long wooden paddle to slide loaves deep into the chamber, moving with a speed born of experience. His hands move without hesitation, even when sparks leap dangerously close. The smell that comes out of that oven, you could fall asleep standing right here, just breathing it in. He pulls out a finished loaf and sets it on a cooling mat woven from reeds. It's golden brown, speckled with darker char where the dough kissed the clay. The crust cracks as it cools, releasing wisps of fragrant steam. You can see why bread was so beloved here. It's a small miracle of heat and patience. Another baker nearby is experimenting with shapes, flat rounds, crescent rolls, even small animal forms. You ask, silently, through a curious look, why? And one of them gestures toward a small altar in the corner. Offerings, of course. Some loaves go to the gods, others to the dead, but all pass through human hands first. There's humor even in this devotion. You hear one man joke that if he burns the offering, maybe the gods will appreciate the extra flavor. Everyone laughs. You can imagine a modern version of the same joke, somewhere in a cafe kitchen. Humans haven't changed that much. You watch as two workers carry baskets of fresh bread toward the edge of the yard, where a woman waits with a clay tablet. She inspects each batch, marking tiny notches with her stylus. Record-keeping again, because in Egypt, even bread is paperwork. The loaves are counted, stored, and distributed according to rank. Some will go to laborers on state projects, others will be sold or traded for oil and vegetables. You wander toward a small shaded area where an older baker tends a secondary fire. He's making flatbread, thinner, more delicate. The dough hisses when it hits the hot surface. Within seconds, bubbles form, then brown blisters. He flips it with his bare fingers, completely unfazed by the heat. You wince just watching. He glances at you and smirks. "Soft hands," his eyes seem to say. He hands you a small piece to taste. You hesitate because, well, ancient hygiene standards, but curiosity wins. You take a bite. It's chewy, smoky, faintly sour. There's something grounding about it, as if the flavor itself carries the history of the soil. You chew slowly, feeling the grit of the flour between your teeth, and realize this is what 3,000 years tastes like. Nearby, a group of children wait eagerly for scraps. The bakers toss them small burned bits from the oven edges, and the kids cheer like they've just won a festival prize. You can't help smiling. In a world without candy, even a burnt corner of bread is treasure. One baker hums as he works, a slow, rhythmic tune that matches the pulse of the ovens.
Another joins in, then another, until the whole yard hums softly with layered voices. It's a song of labor and heat, of repetition turned into music. You feel it in your chest, the steady warmth of life continuing as it always has. A stray dog curls near one of the ovens, clearly aware that this is the warmest place in the village. Occasionally, someone tosses it a crust, and its tail thumps lazily. You reach down to scratch its ear, and it gives you a look that says, "Yeah, I've got it figured out." As the afternoon drifts on, the yard fills with more baskets of loaves. The air shimmers with heat and the faint crackle of cooling bread. The bakers wipe sweat from their brows and stretch their backs, content in the slow satisfaction of work done right. One man gestures toward a tray of oddly shaped loaves, conical, triangular, even one shaped like a bird. He explains that these are for upcoming festivals. The gods deserve variety, after all. You wonder if divine beings ever argue over crust preferences. Historians still debate whether ancient Egyptians flavored their bread intentionally or if it was simply the result of fermentation and chance ingredients. Some loaves contain traces of honey, dates, or carob, luxuries reserved for wealthier households. Others, especially for rituals, were made with milk or oil, giving them a richer texture. You picture the range, from the humblest barley loaf to the elaborate festival bread perfumed with sweeteners and shaped into symbols. Bread wasn't just nourishment, it was identity. The sky begins to tint gold again as the day wanes. The ovens glow dimmer, their fires burning low. The bakers tidy the space, brushing ash aside, stacking cooling baskets, and sealing leftover dough for tomorrow. You sit on a low wall, a half-finished loaf still warm in your hand. The smell of yeast and smoke clings to your clothes, and you find it oddly comforting. This place, noisy and dusty as it is, feels alive in a way that echoes across millennia. You think about how bread here is more than food. It's proof of effort, a quiet triumph over hunger, and a kind of unspoken art form. Each baker leaves his mark, though his name will never be remembered. The last light fades behind the rooftops. Someone laughs softly, another hums a lullaby as they close the ovens. You stand, brushing off your hands, and take one last deep breath of the warm, smoky air. Tomorrow, they'll do it all again. The same rhythm, the same heat, the same miracle of flour and fire. You follow the faint trail of smoke and the rhythmic tap of wood on clay until the scent of baked bread fades behind you. The narrow lane widens again, opening into a space filled with quiet concentration, the potter's workshop. At first glance, it looks like controlled chaos. Clay dust coats everything, the ground, the benches, even the men and women who work here, their forearms the color of the riverbank after rain. Rows of half-finished vessels dry in the sunlight, some upright, others resting on their sides, all in various shades of damp brown. Beyond them, a large kiln smolders, sending up a slow, steady column of pale smoke. You pause to take it in. The air here feels cooler, thicker, and the earthy smell of wet clay replaces the sweet, yeasty warmth of the baker's yard. You can hear the faint scrape of reeds cutting clay, the splash of water, and the hollow sound of hands striking vessels into shape. Every motion seems small, deliberate, and essential. A young apprentice sits cross-legged at a wheel carved from wood and stone. He presses a lump of clay into the spinning disc, guiding it with both hands. The wheel hums softly, powered by his foot against a lower treadle. The clay begins to rise under his fingers, a slow, elegant transformation from formless mud into a vessel's curve. You can almost see the future amphorae of Greece or the porcelain of China emerging in that gesture.
The potter narrows his eyes as the shape grows. His hands move with care, one steadying, the other coaxing. You hold your breath, feeling oddly invested in this wobbling tower of clay. Just when it seems ready to collapse, he straightens it, smoothing the sides with a damp reed. The rhythm of his wheel steadies again. A faint smile crosses his face. Victory! Nearby, a woman is carving patterns into the shoulder of another vessel. Her tool is a sharpened bone, and with each stroke, geometric designs emerge: lines, spirals, zigzags. These are not random decorations, they mean something. Each pot bears a language of texture and form, a quiet statement of who made it and for what purpose. She pauses to dip the tip of her tool into water, then resumes her work. You watch the light play across the wet clay. It's mesmerizing, an ancient collaboration between human patience and the stubbornness of earth. The head potter, a broad-shouldered man with arms like carved wood, oversees the workshop from a shaded corner. He's sorting through shards of broken pottery, running his thumb along their edges. Nothing is wasted here. Broken pieces are crushed back into dust, mixed with fresh clay, and reborn. It feels almost symbolic, the earth reclaiming itself, only to be reshaped again. You walk toward the kiln, drawn by its warmth. The structure rises chest-high, built from mud brick and reinforced with reeds. Its open mouth glows a faint orange, and inside you can glimpse the fire licking around rows of stacked vessels. The air shimmers, carrying the faint crack of expanding clay. A potter's assistant crouches nearby, feeding the fire with handfuls of straw. His face gleams with sweat, his eyes fixed on the flames. He explains, mostly through gestures, that temperature is everything. Too cool and the clay stays soft. Too hot and it shatters. There are no thermometers, no dials, only experience, intuition, and the color of the fire itself. He points toward the opening where the heat burns brightest. See, his expression says, that's how you know. You nod, though what you really see is the timelessness of craft, the way knowledge once lived entirely in the body, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. Someone opens a side vent of the kiln, and a burst of white smoke rolls out. Inside, you glimpse rows of pots glowing dull red, like embers. The assistant grins, satisfied. Good fire, he mouths. A few apprentices sit in the shade, shaping small clay figures. Animals, humans, maybe gods. Their laughter breaks the workshop's rhythm. One of them molds a lopsided cat and sets it next to a jar. Another sculpts what looks like a tiny loaf of bread, offering it to his friend with exaggerated reverence. They both laugh, and you realize that even here, among the most ancient crafts, humor survives. You notice shelves of finished pottery nearby, amphora, bowls, lamps, and jars, each marked with faint finger ridges. Some are plain, others painted with mineral slips that will turn red, black, or cream after firing. A few carry simple images: fish, lotus flowers, geometric suns. These are not merely functional, they're small works of memory. One jar in particular catches your eye. Its surface bears the imprint of a hand, accidental perhaps, pressed before the clay fully dried. You run your fingers along it, fitting your hand into the mark. For a moment, time folds in on itself. You're touching the ghost of another person, someone who stood right here thousands of years ago, shaping the same earth beneath the same sun. A soft voice interrupts your thoughts. The woman who'd been carving patterns gestures toward a low bench. She wants you to try. You hesitate, but curiosity wins. You sit, roll a ball of clay between your palms, and press it onto the center of the wheel. It's cool, pliant, and surprisingly heavy. The potter nods at you to begin spinning the wheel with your foot. You try, awkwardly at first, but soon it begins to turn. You press your thumbs into the clay, and it yields slightly, opening like a slow breath. But the shape wobbles, tilts, and within seconds collapses into a sad little heap. The workshop bursts into laughter. Even the head potter smiles, shaking his head. Everyone starts there, his eyes seem to say. He takes the ruined lump, slaps it once on the table, and begins reshaping it. Within moments, it rises again, smooth, balanced, beautiful. You can't help but marvel. To him, it's effortless. To you, it's a kind of magic. You watch as another potter paints fine red slip onto a row of bowls. The pigment comes from crushed ochre and iron oxide, mixed with water. As he works, he hums a low tune, steady as the wheel's rhythm. When the paint dries, he'll fire them again, sealing the color into the clay. Some will go to temples as offerings, others to households as simple tableware. It strikes you that pottery, like bread, is a story of transformation. Earth becomes vessel, vessel holds water or grain, and when it breaks, it returns to earth again. The cycle is endless, the same story told in new forms. Near the kiln, an older woman arranges small oil lamps. Each one is pinched at the rim to hold a wick. She fills one carefully and lights it, testing the flame. The faint scent of burning oil fills the air, mixing with the earthy smell of clay. She nods in approval and sets it aside. These lamps, you realize, will bring light into homes where the sun cannot reach. Tiny pockets of fire against the darkness. As the afternoon deepens, the workshop grows quieter. The wheels slow, the kiln's fire settles into a low glow. Apprentices stack finished pots onto reed mats, covering them with cloth. A boy carries a jug of water, pouring it over a pile of discarded clay to keep it moist for tomorrow. The hiss of water meeting dust sounds almost like a sigh. You sit near the doorway, watching the light shift across the rows of vessels. Each one seems alive in its stillness, waiting to serve, to hold, to endure. You think about how many of these objects have outlasted the hands that made them, surviving centuries buried in sand. When archaeologists unearth them, they'll marvel at the symmetry, the craftsmanship, the subtle human touch baked forever into the clay. A warm wind drifts through the workshop, stirring a faint cloud of dust. The potters stretch, murmur their goodbyes, and begin to leave. The head potter lingers by the kiln, pressing his palm against its outer wall to feel the residual heat. You mirror his gesture, resting your hand there too. The clay feels warm, alive, almost. He glances at you, then at the glowing sky beyond the doorway. Tomorrow, his look seems to say. You nod. There will always be another dawn, another lump of clay, another fire. You step out into the evening light. The sound of the wheel fades behind you, replaced by the murmur of distant voices and the soft rustle of palms in the breeze. The scent of earth and smoke clings to your hands. You look down at them, fingers streaked with clay, proof that you've touched something ancient, something enduring. Somewhere far off, a dog barks, a child laughs, a pot cools slowly in the dark, and you walk on, the last heat of the kiln still echoing in your palms, carrying with you the quiet heartbeat of the earth shaped by human hands. You follow the smell of smoke and roasting grain as the sun rises higher, warming the pale mud brick walls around you. The palace kitchens and temple storerooms are far behind now, and the world has shifted to a simpler rhythm, the rhythm of everyday life. You find yourself among the narrow alleys of a village that clings to the Nile's edge like reeds to water. Here, life hums softly. Children chase each other between houses. Chickens dart underfoot. Someone laughs, someone else coughs. The air is heavy with the scent of earth, dust, and baking bread. You hear the muffled thump of dough against stone and the hollow echo of pots clinking in shared courtyards. A woman waves to you from a shaded corner, beckoning you closer. Her name doesn't matter, you'll never know it. But her smile is the kind that says, "Sit, stranger, and watch." You join her by a low clay oven shaped like an upturned pot. She works quickly, pulling thin rounds of dough from a flat basket, slapping them against the oven's inner wall with practiced ease. The loaves cling there for a moment before the heat puffs them up, their edges blistering to a golden brown. It smells divine, warm, nutty, slightly sweet. You could swear it's the ancestor of every flatbread you've ever eaten. The woman glances over her shoulder at you, grins, and mutters something that sounds suspiciously like, "You're drooling." You wipe your mouth discreetly. She gestures for you to take one. The bread is hot enough to sting your fingertips, but you accept anyway, tearing off a piece. It's chewy, coarse, flecked with bits of bran and stone dust from the grinding. Not perfect, but somehow perfect enough. This is the bread of the people. Simple, essential. It keeps farmers upright under the sun, feeds children before their morning chores, and fills the stomachs of laborers who build temples they'll never see finished. You look around and notice that every household seems to have its own rhythm of bread making. Some bake early, some late. The ovens are shared, the fuel scarce. People gather reeds, dung, or leftover straw to keep the fires alive. There's laughter, chatter, and a few heated debates about who gets to use the oven next. An old man leans on his walking stick, watching the loaves inflate. "Bread and beer," he says. "That's all anyone really needs." He chuckles, a raspy sound. Then, as if reading your mind, he adds, "Pharaoh may eat his honey loaves, but he still bleeds the same when the baker slips with a knife." You're not sure whether to laugh or nod, so you do both. You follow him through the winding paths of the village. The houses are made of mud brick, small, uneven, but home. Their roofs are flat, serving as sleeping places on hot nights or drying racks for grain. Everywhere there's movement. Women grinding flour on querns, men weaving nets or patching baskets, children rolling balls of clay. He leads you to a shaded courtyard where several families share a communal oven. A large, cracked jar stands nearby, filled with bubbling starter, a living, breathing thing. You watch as one woman kneads a lump of dough, then tears a piece from it, dropping it into the jar to feed tomorrow's batch. The cycle continues endlessly. Yeast, the old man says, though not in your tongue, the invisible helper. He points to the jar and grins. You realize this is sourdough in its earliest form, a culture passed from hand to hand, family to family, year to year. You think about how that same lineage might stretch forward in time, unbroken, into your own kitchen thousands of years later. Nearby, two boys are flattening dough on smooth stones. One sprinkles sesame seeds on top, stolen from his mother's spice jar. The other laughs, calling him a thief. They both dart away as someone shouts their names from a doorway. The smell of toasted sesame lingers in the air. You wander toward the riverbank, where farmers unload baskets of barley and emmer from their small reed boats. Grain taxes, you realize, part of the pharaoh's share. But the farmers keep some for themselves, carefully measured and stored in tall, narrow jars sealed with clay stoppers. A woman sits beside one of these jars, counting loaves wrapped in woven reed mats. You watch her lips move as she murmurs numbers, her finger tracing each bundle. Bread is currency here, payment, offering, survival. Workers on temple projects are paid in bread and beer rations. Families trade loaves for fish, oil, or salt. One man trudges by carrying a stack of round loaves tied together with string. He stops to rest, sets the bundle down, and looks up at the sky.
If only Ra would give us shade instead of light, he mutters. You can't help but smile. Ancient Egypt's first weather complaint, preserved just for you. As the day grows hotter, the air fills with the low hum of daily routine. You find yourself drawn to another house where a young mother sits with her child on her lap. She's feeding the baby small bits of softened bread soaked in milk. The baby gurgles happily, smearing crumbs across her arm. The mother sighs, amused, and wipes it away with the edge of her tunic. For a moment, the whole world feels gentle, still, the kind of quiet where even the Nile seems to pause. She notices you watching and gestures toward a loaf cooling beside her. You pick it up. It's heavy, round, and scored with shallow cuts across the top. She breaks it open, revealing a crumb that's dense but fragrant. Barley, she says, then taps another loaf, smaller and lighter. Emmer, she grins. Pharaoh eats wheat. We eat this. You take a bite. The bread tastes earthy and slightly sour. It sticks to your teeth, fills your mouth with the taste of grain and effort. This isn't a meal of luxury, but of endurance. A few men gather nearby, eating their midday rations. One tells a story about a baker who tried to pass off stale loaves as fresh and got caught when the overseer bit into one and cracked his tooth. Everyone laughs. Then someone mutters, "At least he still had teeth." More laughter follows. Humor, it seems, is timeless too. You notice one man breaking his bread carefully into equal pieces, saving half in a small cloth pouch. When you ask, he shrugs. Tomorrow. He knows that hunger waits just a sunrise away. The afternoon sun turns everything gold and sleepy. The village slows down. You hear the rhythmic creak of a water wheel somewhere nearby, the occasional bray of a donkey, the hiss of cooling ovens. The woman from before fans her fire gently, coaxing one last batch before the day fades. She glances at you and says something you don't quite understand, but her tone is unmistakable. You should rest. You sit in the shade of a wall, the air still thick with the scent of baked bread. Historians still argue whether the lower classes of Egypt truly suffered constant hunger, or whether their communal grain systems provided relative stability. Some say the people were well fed. Others claim famine was always just one bad flood away. Either way, each loaf you've seen today feels like a small victory against uncertainty. A child runs past you holding a piece of bread like a trophy. Behind him, his mother scolds him, half laughing, half exasperated. The bread breaks in two, scattering crumbs across the sand. You notice a few sparrows swoop down immediately, claiming their share. Life here wastes nothing. Not grain, not effort, not even laughter. As twilight nears, the villagers gather to share the evening meal. Loaves are broken, bowls of lentil stew passed around. Someone strums a simple tune on a stringed instrument. Others hum softly along. The day ends the way it began, with bread, warmth, and quiet companionship. You take another bite of that rough, wonderful bread. It's gritty between your teeth, but somehow the flavor deepens as the light fades. You think about how this same act, breaking bread with others, will echo through countless centuries and faiths. You feel the weight of continuity, of simple sustenance linking you to them. The stars begin to bloom overhead, one by one. The villagers settle in for rest. The fires dim, and the smell of bread lingers like memory itself, warm, humble, eternal. You close your eyes, still tasting the grain on your tongue, hearing the faint murmur of voices. Somewhere beyond the village, the Nile whispers to itself in the dark, and a single oven crackles with leftover heat. The day is done. The people have eaten. Tomorrow they'll wake again and begin the sacred, ordinary work of turning grain into life.
The morning haze still lingers over the Nile as you leave the village behind. The quiet chatter of the common folk fades, replaced by the solemn hum of chanting carried on the wind. You're drawn toward the sound, low, steady, and ancient. The path curves uphill, winding past palm groves and limestone walls until the first glimpse of a temple rises before you, vast, serene, and carved with stories that seem too large for any single lifetime. The temple gate towers above you, flanked by colossal statues of the god it honors. You tilt your head back and still can't see the top. The faces of the statues are calm, distant, half watching, half dreaming. They have seen empires rise and crumble, but the offerings never stop. At the entrance, a line of servants and priests shuffle past, carrying baskets covered with linen cloths. The smell that follows them is unmistakable. Bread, fresh and warm. Not the rough loaves of the villagers, but smooth, round ones glazed with honey, scented faintly of carob and sesame. You catch the faint sweetness in the air and realize this is bread not meant for eating. You follow the procession inside. The stone corridors swallow the sound of footsteps. Cool air replaces the warmth of the sun. The walls glow with painted figures, men kneeling before gods, offering them loaves in neat pyramids. Each figure is frozen mid-gesture, holding a perfect triangle of bread as if the act itself sustains the universe. In the inner courtyard, long tables overflow with offerings, rows upon rows of bread, fruit, beer, and flowers. The priests move among them like caretakers of a divine bakery, adjusting arrangements, replacing older loaves with fresh ones. You pause by a particularly large loaf shaped like a small pyramid. Its surface glistens with honey. A priest notices your gaze and smiles faintly. "This one," he murmurs, "is for Amun himself. He prefers his bread sweet." You're not sure if he's joking, but his tone has that dry Egyptian humor that turns reverence into something almost human. You watch as a young acolyte carries a tray of smaller loaves toward the inner sanctum. They're shaped differently, spiraled, conical, and even braided. Some historians argue these shapes held symbolic meanings: spirals for eternity, cones for divine ascent. Others think the bakers were simply showing off. The debate remains unresolved, though one suspects the gods appreciated variety as much as mortals do. The inner temple smells of incense and stone. You can barely see, the air so thick with smoke it blurs the edges of everything. The high priest raises a loaf above his head, chanting words that seem older than language itself. The sound reverberates against the stone walls, slow and hypnotic. You feel it more than hear it, a vibration in your chest. He sets the loaf before a massive statue of the god, its face half lost in shadow. For a moment, it feels as though the eyes might flicker open, but they don't. The god remains silent, unmoved. Still, the offering continues. Later, outside the sanctuary, you watch another group of attendants begin the post-ritual work, clearing the tables, sorting what's to be redistributed. Contrary to what you might expect, none of the food goes to waste. Once the ceremony ends, the offerings are considered blessed, and the priests, temple staff, and sometimes even local poor share in the divine leftovers. You spot a young boy sneaking a piece of bread from one of the baskets when he thinks no one's looking. A priest catches him, but only laughs, tussling his hair. "The gods won't miss one bite," he says, handing him another. The boy grins and darts off into the sunlight. It's an oddly practical faith. Nothing wasted, everything cyclical. Bread ascends from earth to altar, then returns to the people again, sanctified and sustaining. You walk deeper into the temple complex, passing storerooms stacked high with baskets of grain. Scribes sit cross-legged nearby, tallying deliveries. Their reed pens scratch across papyrus scrolls, recording every measure. Bread is not just food here, it's economy, devotion, and record-keeping combined. If the grain doesn't arrive, the gods don't eat. If the gods don't eat, the sun won't rise. You blink, unsure if it's metaphor or warning. He just smirks and returns to his work. In another chamber, women knead dough for tomorrow's offerings. Their hands move with a rhythm so natural, it's almost meditative. The dough gleams under the dim torchlight, soft and pliant. They shape the loaves carefully, some plain, others filled with dates or brushed with oil. You notice one woman pressing tiny symbols into the dough, using a carved wooden stamp. You ask her what it means. She shrugs. "The god's name," she says softly, "so he knows which one is his." You imagine a divine bakery where each loaf bears a cosmic address label. Somewhere, in the infinite bureaucracy of the afterlife, perhaps a god frowns when he receives the wrong flavor. One priest passes by carrying a tray of oddly dark loaves. They look burned. When you ask about them, another priest explains, "For the underworld gods. They prefer what's touched by fire." He grins. "It's an acquired taste." Historians still argue whether these so-called burnt offerings were symbolic gestures or accidental results rebranded as spiritual successes. Either way, it seems even divine beings appreciate a bit of creative damage control. Outside, the courtyard buzzes again with life. Villagers approach the gates with their own humble offerings. Small baskets of grain, a few onions, perhaps a round loaf baked that morning. They wait patiently in line as priests collect and bless their gifts. The people bow low, whispering prayers for health, good harvests, or the safe passage of loved ones. You stand among them, watching as an old woman presses her loaf into a priest's hands. Her back is bent, her face lined by decades of sun, but her eyes are bright. The priest murmurs a blessing and returns a small crumb of bread to her palm, a token of divine favor. She tucks it into her garment carefully as though it were gold. For her, this exchange isn't superstition, it's conversation. The bread speaks where words fail. Nearby, a group of workers unload sacks of flour marked with the symbol of the temple. These are part of the state's ration system, redistributed to sustain the priesthood. In return, the priests perform rituals believed to maintain ma'at, the balance of the cosmos. Without offerings, the order of the universe might falter. It's a surprisingly delicate system, political, spiritual, and agricultural threads woven together, each dependent on the others. Bread becomes both literal sustenance and cosmic glue. As afternoon light floods the courtyard, the stone walls glow honey gold. You wander to a quieter corner where older offerings, dried loaves hardened to stone, rest atop a small altar. They've long since turned inedible, but still, no one removes them. It would feel like stealing from eternity. You crouch to look closer. The loaves are perfectly preserved, their fingerprints and scoring marks still visible after centuries. One bears a faint impression of a woven mat, a ghost pattern from the day it was formed. You reach out, but stop short, not daring to touch.
We were made, offered, forgotten, yet still here. You rise slowly, glancing toward the distant sanctuary. The smoke of incense drifts upward in thin ribbons, dissolving into the sky. Somewhere beyond those walls, the chant continues, a sound as old as civilization itself. As you step outside, the sunlight blinds you for a moment. The world beyond the temple feels louder, more alive. Farmers shout from the riverbank, Children chase goats, traders haggle in the dust. But in your ears, the echo of those chants lingers.
You realize that in ancient Egypt, religion wasn't separate from daily life. It was daily life. The same hands that baked a family's breakfast also shaped bread for the gods. The same grain that fed a farmer sustained a king's tomb. The air smells again of wheat, smoke, and honey. You take one last look at the temple, its vast shadow stretching over the sand. Somewhere inside, loaves cool quietly on stone tables, untouched yet essential. You turn back toward the village path, the hum of prayer fading into the sound of the Nile's current. The river glints like molten gold, carrying silt, life, and the memory of 1,000 offerings downstream. You walk slowly, the sun dipping low, and you think, maybe the gods didn't eat the bread at all. Maybe they just wanted humans to keep baking, to keep giving shape to gratitude. You wander down the narrow lanes of Deir el-Medina, the air thick with desert warmth and the faint smell of yeast and ash. The sun, now low behind the cliffs, paints everything in dusty amber. The same cliffs that hold the tombs of kings, carved by the very artisans who live here. You pause, listening to the murmur of voices, the sound of chisel against limestone echoing from afar, and somewhere nearby, the comforting thud of dough being kneaded. This village, home to the royal tomb builders, is unlike any other in Egypt. It's small, tidy, organized, built for skilled hands that labor for eternity. And of course, even these artisans, who carve gods into stone, must eat bread. You turn a corner and find them. Two men laughing as they shape loaves beside a dome-shaped oven, the surface blackened from years of use. Their hands move with the rhythm of long practice. Scoop, fold, slap, dust, repeat. They talk about chisel angles and copper tool shortages while the dough rises in woven baskets beside them. You watch as a woman, maybe a baker's wife or daughter, brings water from a clay jug to moisten the flour. The scent of fermentation mingles with sweat and limestone dust, oddly comforting. Bread here isn't just food, it's a daily act of cooperation. The workers rely on one another to bake, share, and ration. Every day, the community receives measured portions of grain, recorded carefully by scribes. You can imagine the scribe at his low table, brush in hand, marking each household's share on a strip of limestone or a pottery shard. A loaf short, and there might be muttering. A loaf extra, and someone owes a favor. The loaves you see baked here are nothing like the soft, airy kind you know today. They're dense, often studded with bits of grit from the grinding stones. Each bite a reminder of labor. You can almost feel the texture in your mouth, heavy, chewy, earthy. It's said that many workers' teeth were worn down by years of eating bread mixed with microscopic sand. That's one way to get your daily minerals, though not one any dentist would recommend. Still, these bakers of Deir el-Medina are proud of their craft. Their ovens glow like small suns, each one a center of warmth and gossip. You hear snatches of conversation, news from Thebes, a debate about whether the overseer will allow an extra day off for the festival of Hathor, and of course, talk of who baked the best loaf last week. Someone jokes about how even the gods in their painted tombs must envy the smell of this bread. It's funny to think that, despite the solemn work of carving tombs for immortality, life in this village is so vividly human. The bakers' children run barefoot, chasing each other between rows of houses. A cat slinks close to the oven, hoping for crumbs. Someone hums a tune, perhaps the same one hummed by bakers 1,000 years earlier along the Nile. History here doesn't feel distant, it feels alive, breathing in yeast and laughter. As you watch the bakers shape a new batch of dough, one of them gestures for you to look closer.
He dips his fingers into a small jar of something dark and sticky, date syrup maybe, and swirls it into the top of a loaf. "For sweetness," he murmurs, in a tone you imagine as a wink. You can almost smell the caramel warmth of it as the loaf slides into the oven. Later tonight, when the laborers return from the Valley of the Kings, that sweet bread will vanish within minutes. A mainstream fact comes to mind. Archaeologists actually discovered preserved loaves in the ruins of Deir el-Medina, carbonized but recognizable, some still bearing fingerprints where they'd been pressed before baking. It's strange, isn't it? Thousands of years later, a moment of daily life frozen in ash, proof that someone once stood exactly where you imagine yourself now, brushing flour from their hands. Then there's a quirkier tidbit. Some of these same artisans used leftover bread dough as makeshift modeling clay, shaping little figures or toys for their children before tossing them into the oven alongside dinner. A combination of practicality and whimsy that feels almost modern. You picture a child's handprint immortalized in crust, a fleeting moment turned to artifact. Historians still argue whether the bakers of Deir el-Medina were part of an official workforce or semi-independent artisans. Some say they were state employees feeding the royal project. Others believe they worked more like freelancers, providing bread for both workers and temple offerings. Either way, their loaves sustained a kingdom of craftsmen whose chisels carved eternity. You follow one baker as he carries a tray of steaming bread through the winding streets. People nod to him in gratitude. A child reaches out to grab a crust and gets gently scolded. He sets the loaves inside a storage room, cool, dark, smelling of grain and earth. Here, bread is rationed, but not stingy. Everyone gets their share, a quiet testament to how this little village sustains itself. Outside, dusk has settled. Torches flicker along the pathways. The sound of hammers has stopped, replaced by laughter and low conversation. Someone plays a simple flute tune. You sit by the oven, the embers pulsing like a heartbeat, and feel the day's rhythm slow. The bakers begin their cleanup, scraping dough from bowls, sweeping flour, stacking tools. One of them sits on a stone ledge and sighs, a long, contented breath. "Another day, another loaf for the gods," he might say, half joking, half grateful. You find yourself reflecting on how these simple acts, grinding, kneading, baking, link everyone in this ancient world. Pharaoh or peasant, priest or mason, all depend on the humble loaf. The bakers of Deir el-Medina may not build tombs or paint walls, but their work keeps the hands that do so alive. You imagine them unaware that thousands of years later, their fingerprints would still whisper from charred crusts, telling us how much effort it took to simply eat, live, and endure. The night deepens. You can see the faint glow of Thebes far across the river, and above, the stars spill across the desert sky like grains of flour. The smell of baked bread lingers, blending with cool desert air. Someone nearby hums a prayer to Ptah, patron of craftsmen. You close your eyes, listening to the steady crackle of the cooling oven, and let the warmth drift over you. Soft, rhythmic, timeless. In this moment, you understand that history isn't written in monuments alone. It's baked into bread, into calloused hands, into the quiet satisfaction of those who feed others. Here, in the heart of a worker's village, the story of Egypt feels human, warm, and deeply familiar, just like the scent rising from that final loaf cooling in the dark. The next morning rises warm and bright, the desert air already shimmering as the sun glides over the cliffs. You find yourself sitting cross-legged on a low stool beside a group of laborers taking their breakfast before heading out to the work sites. A simple meal, nothing fancy, nothing fit for temples or kings, but there's something quietly beautiful about it.
Loaves of bread, round and flat, still warm from the hearth, sit beside small jugs of cloudy amber beer. It's the kind of breakfast that has sustained Egypt for thousands of years. You tear off a piece of bread, its surface rough and speckled, the crumb dense and hearty. It smells faintly sour and earthy, a flavor shaped by the grain itself, emmer wheat, the backbone of Egypt's diet. One of the workers laughs, lifting his jug toward you. The beer looks thick, more like liquid bread than the crisp golden kind you might know. You take a cautious sip. It's tangy, grainy, alive with yeast, and surprisingly filling. You can see why they drink it morning, noon, and night. It's nourishment in a cup. Bread and beer, two sides of the same process, two children of grain. You begin to realize that in ancient Egypt, they weren't separate luxuries, but partners in daily survival. The same flour, the same yeast, the same fermentation, all transforming simple grain into sustenance. Bread feeds the body, beer refreshes the soul, and, conveniently, sterilizes questionable Nile water. You could say they invented multitasking. The workers eat slowly, savoring the first calm of the day before the desert heat bears down. They talk about the new wall being carved in the Valley of the Kings, about the overseer's temper, about someone's new donkey. Life moves at a measured pace here, one shaped by sunlight and survival. You watch a woman refill a jug, the beer frothing as she pours it, her laugh echoing across the courtyard. There's something meditative about it, the rhythmic tearing of bread, the sip of beer, the soft murmur of conversation. You almost forget how ancient this moment is. Archaeologists have found traces of this very routine in workers' villages like Deir el-Medina and Amarna. Breadcrumbs in clay bowls, beer residue in jars, charred grains stuck to cooking pots. Ordinary meals preserved by time. Proof that history is built not just by kings, but by breakfast. A mainstream fact slips through your mind: Egyptian rations often included both bread and beer as official payment for labor. Workers constructing temples or royal tombs were compensated in food and drink rather than coins. Records from the village show lists of ration loaves and beer jars distributed per worker per day. Imagine getting paid in carbs and craft brew. It might just make Monday mornings more tolerable. And here's a quirky tidbit: some brewing vats were lined with date pulp to add sweetness and kickstart fermentation, meaning the average worker might have started the day with what was basically a proto-smoothie of grain and fruit. Not bad for 1300 BCE. Historians still argue whether ancient Egyptian beer actually contained alcohol or was more of a thick, porridge-like energy drink. Some chemical analyses show ethanol content. Others suggest it was more nutritious than intoxicating. Either way, people drank it constantly, from farmers to priests to children, and no one judged them for day drinking, because in a world without plumbing, beer was the safe option. You take another slow sip, feeling the warmth settle in your stomach. Around you, the workers laugh louder now, their spirits lifted. Someone cracks a joke about the overseer's hair looking like an unbaked loaf. Another retorts that he'd still eat it if it came with honey. The laughter feels timeless, the kind that bridges centuries. As the meal winds down, you follow one man. He calls himself Hori, back to his modest home. He shows you his household altar, a tiny clay niche with a few offerings, a small loaf, a bowl of beer, and a sprig of herbs. Bread and beer again, even for the gods. They eat what we eat, he says with a shrug. You realize that for the Egyptians, the divine wasn't far away. It shared their table, their hunger, their daily rituals. Later, when you step outside again, the sun has climbed high. You find yourself drawn to a nearby open-air kitchen. A woman is kneeling beside a flat stone, grinding grain with steady, practiced movements.
The rhythmic rasp fills the air like a heartbeat. Her daughter sits beside her, shaping small discs of dough, pressing them between palms dusted with flour. They bake them quickly on a heated stone, producing crisp little rounds that smell faintly smoky. The girl hands you one, smiling shyly. You bite in. It's dry, crumbly, simple, but perfect. Nearby, a jug of beer sits cooling in the shade. The woman nods toward it, wordlessly inviting you to drink. You pour a little into a clay cup and notice how the foam settles slowly, leaving a yeasty aroma that reminds you of fresh dough. The connection between bread and beer feels so seamless now, you can hardly separate them. One ferments longer, one bakes hotter, but both are born from the same miracle of grain and time. You recall something an Egyptologist once wrote: "Bread was the body of life, beer its spirit." And in this moment, you understand why. A breeze rolls through, carrying the faint scent of the river. It's mixed with the sweetness of malt and the comforting must of flour. The simplicity of it all feels grounding. You picture entire families ending their day this same way, sharing bread and beer under a starlit sky, laughter soft and unhurried, the cares of labor dissolving into dusk. Here's another curious fact to mull over. At major festivals, people didn't just eat bread and drink beer, they danced for it. The Feast of Drunkenness, held in honor of the goddess Hathor, celebrated the connection between joy, fertility, and fermented grain. Thousands would gather to drink sacred beer, sing, and celebrate life's renewal. It was both party and prayer. Historians still debate whether everyone was truly drunk or whether the ritual was symbolic. Either way, it seems Egypt knew how to mix spirituality with a good buzz. You watch as twilight begins to seep into the village. The bakers' ovens glow faintly, orange against the deepening blue. A group of children carries baskets of cooling bread to the communal storehouse. You can almost hear the hum of conversation as families prepare their evening meals. Someone hums a lullaby, slow and warm, drifting over the rooftops like smoke. As you sit there, the rhythmic link between bread and beer takes on a deeper meaning. They are the twin anchors of Egyptian existence: work and rest, hunger and satisfaction, earth and air. Both require patience, both rely on unseen forces: yeast rising in silence, fermentation bubbling below the surface. In a way, both are tiny acts of faith, that something invisible will bring nourishment, that transformation will happen if you simply wait. You close your eyes, and the world narrows to the soft sounds around you. The whisper of wind through palm leaves, the faint laughter of children, the creak of an oven door. Somewhere, a pot of beer bubbles gently, and the smell of baking bread seeps into the night. You feel it settle over you like a blanket, warm, familiar, eternal. In a land built on stone and sand, it's easy to think of eternity as something grand: pyramids, gods, hieroglyphs. But here, watching a family break bread and pour beer, you sense that eternity might also live in smaller things: the taste of grain, the rhythm of sharing, the simple comfort of being fed. You lift the cup one last time, the beer thick on your tongue, and breathe in the soft scent of yeast and earth. It's the smell of life itself, the same scent that rose from ovens thousands of years ago, drifting into the same Egyptian dusk. The sun hangs low in the sky, casting long shadows across the riverbanks as you make your way toward the bustling market of Thebes. The city is alive with activity, a place where the scent of fresh bread competes with the aroma of spices, fish, and roasting meat. Merchants shout their wares, children dodge between feet, and women carry baskets of goods balanced expertly on their heads.
Amidst the chaos, the smell of baked bread rises, weaving through the noise, a constant reminder that no matter how grand the temples or palaces, life here depends on flour, water, and fire.
You find a stall piled high with loaves of every conceivable shape: flat discs, thick round buns, braided strands, even small loaves shaped like fish or lotus flowers. The baker, a stout man with flour-dusted arms, is busy handing change to a customer while gesturing toward his wares with a broad, floury hand. His fingers bear the faint scars of years spent kneading coarse dough, pushing it onto hot stones, and coaxing it into shape. You reach out to touch one of the flatbreads. It feels surprisingly dense and warm, almost pliable, like it could bend if you press too hard. He grins at your hesitation. First time in Thebes? His voice rumbles softly. Be careful, you might leave with half a basket and a full stomach. You laugh and pick up a loaf, noting the faint scoring across its surface. It's not just decoration, it tells you how to break the bread evenly. Each cut is a guide, a small gesture to help people share what is often more precious than coin. Nearby, a woman sells small, crisp loaves that are filled with dates or figs. Children tug at her skirts, begging for one, and she indulges them with a wink, placing the bread in their small hands. You notice that even in the hustle of commerce, there's a rhythm here: give, receive, taste, savor. The market is a living illustration of what historians still argue about: the role of bread as both nourishment and social currency. Some say it was purely sustenance. Others claim it reinforced social hierarchies, with higher quality loaves reserved for the elite. Either way, the baker here seems unconcerned with theory, focused instead on feeding anyone willing to pay or plead. A quirky sight catches your eye: a man shaping dough into tiny figurines of animals and gods. They aren't meant to be eaten, yet they share the same grainy texture as the bread around him. You learn that some Egyptians used leftover dough for talismans or charms, small symbolic offerings for household shrines. You can't help but smile at the thought of tiny clay-like loaves sitting on altars, a miniature echo of the daily bread consumed with gusto. You move through the market, absorbing the sights and sounds. Women weigh grain, men haggle over clay pots, and someone drags a donkey laden with sacks of flour. You stop by a stall selling barley, and a boy demonstrates how it will be ground, sifted, and baked into loaves that will sustain families for the week. It's mesmerizing, the care and repetition of it. Every step seems mundane, yet it carries centuries of knowledge and practice. In the shadow of a temple, a group of priests distribute bread to the poor. Loaves are torn in half and handed to waiting hands. The people bow low, whispering prayers of thanks as they accept this simple gift. You realize that bread here is more than food. It is community, charity, and a quiet bridge between the mortal and divine. A small boy drops his portion accidentally, and a sparrow swoops in to claim it. Even nature respects the ritual. You pause at another stall where a baker has set up a simple oven. He kneads dough with deliberate movements, folding it over and pressing it down. He sprinkles sesame seeds on top and slides the loaves onto a heated stone. You watch as the bread puffs and browns. He hums a low tune, a rhythm passed down from his own father and grandfather. You note the faint sound of bubbling fermentation as the yeast does its quiet work. This same bread, you realize, is the backbone of both daily life and celebration. A woman beside you hands you a piece of a loaf straight from the oven. It's warm, slightly chewy, with a hint of toasted grains. You taste it slowly, savoring the texture and flavor. Around you, life continues. The clatter of carts, the shouts of vendors, the laughter of children. Yet in that single bite, You feel connected to countless Egyptians who have broken bread in this very city. A mainstream fact asserts itself in your mind. Bread in ancient Egypt was often used as payment, a form of wage. Laborers, scribes, and even temple workers received daily rations of bread and beer, ensuring that the wheels of society could turn. Some loaves were even stamped with the name of the baker or overseer, acting as a guarantee of quality. You glance at a stamped loaf and imagine the tiny message it carries across time. A signature, a promise, and a mark of pride. Quirky details emerge as you continue your walk. You notice a loaf shaped like a lotus blossom, tiny cuts radiating outward to mimic petals. The baker explains that such forms were sometimes offered to deities, each shape carrying symbolic meaning. Some shapes, scholars still argue, represented concepts like fertility, rebirth, or divine favor. Others think the designs were purely decorative or whimsical. You watch the children marvel at the forms, their eyes wide, unaware of centuries of debate, but fully engaged in wonder. The sun tilts lower, shadows stretching across the market. You linger by an older woman arranging small loaves on a woven tray. She hums a quiet tune as she works, each movement precise yet gentle. A bird lands nearby, pecking at crumbs. She smiles, whispers to it, and turns back to her task. Bread, in this moment, seems like more than sustenance. It is meditation, ritual, and art all rolled into one. As twilight falls, the market slows. Merchants begin packing up, children run home, and the aroma of baking fades into the cooler evening air. You find a quiet corner and take a final loaf in hand, appreciating its weight, its texture, the faint imprint of human effort upon it. Bread in Thebes is everywhere, yet each piece feels personal, intimate, and indispensable. Historians still argue whether urban Egyptians had access to the same quality of bread as rural folk, or whether city life demanded adaptations in baking methods and grain types. You consider the bustling market and think perhaps the truth is somewhere in between. Both necessity and artistry shaped each loaf, and every mouthful carried the mark of survival, skill, and culture. As night blankets the city, you bite into the loaf, savoring its dense, earthy flavor. The market falls silent, except for a distant flute playing a soft tune. The stars emerge overhead, twinkling above the Nile, above rooftops, and above the ovens that have fed generations. Bread, you realize, is a constant, sustaining the body, nurturing the soul, and binding human lives together in rhythms both simple and eternal. Night has settled gently over Thebes, and the streets have quieted, except for the occasional clatter of a cart returning from the outer markets. You wander through the dim alleys, drawn by the faint smell of bread still warm from late bakings, and notice the soft glow of lamps flickering against the mud brick walls. In the cool evening, the city takes on a different character, calmer, slower, and more intimate. This is the time when families gather, when laborers finally lay down their tools, and when bread, fresh or cooled, becomes the centerpiece of shared meals. You come across a small courtyard where a family sits cross-legged on woven mats. Their evening meal is simple: loaves of coarse emmer bread, a jug of beer, and a few bowls of lentils. The father tears off a piece of bread, hands it to his eldest child, who carefully dips it into a bowl of lentils and then shares a piece with the mother. You watch the gestures, the careful division, the tiny smiles exchanged over crumbs, the soft hum of a lullaby in the background. It's mundane, yet there is a ritualistic cadence to it, a rhythm as old as the city itself. You take a loaf from the pile on the mat, noticing its density and weight. Unlike the refined breads of the palace or temple, this bread is hearty and coarse, made to sustain the family through long days.
Yet it carries its own quiet satisfaction, the taste of effort and continuity baked into every bite. You can almost feel the centuries of practice embedded in the texture. Grinding, kneading, shaping, baking, a chain that stretches back through generations.
A mainstream fact drifts into your thoughts. Many families relied on communal ovens. Individual households often lacked proper baking facilities, so neighbors took turns heating and using the oven. This practice strengthened social bonds as much as it baked bread. Watching the family, you imagine how they too might share stories, laugh, and pass along small secrets while waiting for their loaves to cook, just as their neighbors do in parallel courtyards across the city. Quirkier details emerge when you notice a small loaf shaped like a tiny crocodile, decorated with carved lines to suggest scales. The mother tells the child it is a gift for Sobek, the river god, to ensure safe fishing trips and healthy crops. You smile, realizing that even everyday bread carries symbolism, tiny prayers pressed into dough. Historians still argue whether such symbolic loaves were primarily ritualistic or more of a playful domestic tradition. But either way, they reveal the layers of meaning that ancient Egyptians infused into ordinary life. You follow the faint clatter of another oven in the distance, where a baker still tends to a batch of loaves. The heat radiates in waves, making the air shimmer above the stones. You watch as he slides a flatbread onto the surface, the dough hissing slightly as it meets the hot stone. There's a sense of rhythm here. Scoop, stretch, slap, and slide. The process is repetitive but hypnotic, almost meditative. Each movement both functional and ritualistic. There's a sense of rhythm here. Scoop, stretch, slap, and slide. The process is repetitive but hypnotic, almost meditative. Each movement both functional and ritualistic. Nearby, children play with scraps of dough, forming little balls and pressing them into shallow imprints. You can't help but notice the ingenuity. A leftover corner of dough becomes a miniature toy, a piece of imagination. The baker glances over, chuckles, and allows it. It's a small mercy, a quiet recognition that not everything in life needs to be measured or precise. Even a tiny, playful piece of dough has its place. As the night deepens, the city hums softly. In one courtyard, someone begins chanting a lullaby, the sound carried faintly across the rooftops. You pause to listen, the rhythm of their voice blending with the distant gurgle of the Nile and the occasional bark of a dog. Bread and music, nourishment and rhythm, they are companions, each enhancing the other. The smell of baked dough clings to the air, faint but persistent, like a memory you can almost touch. The baker brings out a small jug of beer, and you watch as the family pours a few drops into a bowl for a child. Even the youngest is included in the ritual of consumption, teaching respect, sharing, and gratitude. It is intimate, simple, yet profoundly human. Bread is not just food, it is a medium for connection, a vessel for memory and community. You notice one loaf bearing faint fingerprints, perhaps from the baker's child. It's curious how these tiny impressions remain etched into the crust even after baking. They are inadvertent signatures, reminders that human touch, no matter how small, leaves a mark. This ordinary bread becomes a document of life itself, quiet proof that someone lived, shaped, and nourished their family with care. A mainstream observation surfaces again. Food in ancient Egypt was highly structured. Workers, artisans, and common families all followed patterns of consumption, often tied to religious calendars and festivals. Certain breads were reserved for offerings, others for daily sustenance, and some carried symbolic meanings specific to times of the year. Even within one family, the distinction was maintained. One loaf might be ordinary, while another bore marks for the gods. And yet, the quirky layer persists. You notice a small loaf pressed with a flower-shaped imprint. The child giggles, pointing at it. It's as if play and ritual coexist seamlessly here, an echo of how life, even in antiquity, mingled the sacred and the ordinary without rigid separation. Scholars still debate the exact significance of such imprints, whether purely decorative or subtly instructive, teaching children symbols of fertility, renewal, or devotion. You sip some of the beer, feeling its warm, slightly tangy weight in your mouth. The bread's chewy, nutty flavor lingers on your tongue. You watch the family finish their meal, the evening settling into calm, the bustling city fading into the distance. The courtyard glows softly under the light of clay lamps, shadows dancing against the walls. You think about how countless generations of Egyptians have experienced this same combination of bread, beer, and family warmth. It is timeless, a ritual as vital as any temple ceremony. Finally, you stand and stretch, the sounds of the city lulling into quiet. The baker tidies the last crumbs, the family settles onto mats for the night, and a gentle breeze carries the aroma of dough through the streets. Bread has served its purpose today, feeding, connecting, comforting. It is ordinary, yet extraordinary, a small miracle in the rhythm of daily life. You take one last deep breath, letting the scents, sights, and subtle sounds of the city fill your senses. The Nile whispers in the distance. The stars emerge over the desert horizon, and the night feels soft and enduring. Even as the world sleeps, the cycle of grain, dough, and human care continues quietly, without fanfare, but with unwavering fidelity. Dawn arrives slowly over the eastern horizon, and with it, the subtle clatter of preparation. You follow the sound to a small bakery near the riverbank, where the smell of fresh bread greets you like an old friend. The ovens glow faintly, casting warm light over rough-hewn tables, flour-streaked walls, and the hands of bakers already at work. There's a rhythm here, quiet, measured, almost meditative. You watch as one baker folds a lump of dough, sprinkles a little water, and presses it gently into a round loaf. His movements are deliberate, each one honed through years of practice. The village around the bakery begins to stir. Children run barefoot across dusty streets, goats bleat in the distance, and merchants set up their early stalls. But the bakery, with its simple stone ovens, feels like the heart of everything. Here, bread is not just sustenance, it is livelihood, ritual, and pride. You note how carefully the bakers portion the dough, measuring by eye or with a simple wooden scoop. The resulting loaves are uniform in size, yet each carries slight differences, a fingerprint of human attention embedded in every crust. You reach out to touch a loaf, feeling its warmth and slight resistance. It is dense and heavy, unlike the airy bread you might buy today, yet it feels nourishing in its solidity. You tear a piece and taste it, earthy, subtly sweet, faintly sour, with the texture of stone-ground grains. One bite, and you understand why this bread has endured as the staple of life in Egypt for centuries. A mainstream fact emerges. Most bread in ancient Egypt was made from emmer wheat, often mixed with barley. It was coarsely ground, leaving tiny specks of bran and husk in every bite. The resulting texture was hearty and filling, perfect for laborers, farmers, and artisans who spent long hours in the sun. You can imagine the simple satisfaction of chewing this bread after a long day, the warm, dense loaf slowly replenishing energy spent in work. Nearby, a woman shapes a loaf into a conical form, her hands moving deftly. This shape, historians argue, may have held symbolic meaning, representing fertility or divine ascent. Others believe it was simply practical, allowing the bread to bake evenly and store well. You watch her as she presses small marks into the top of the dough with a wooden stamp, tiny hieroglyphs representing grains, offerings, or perhaps personal symbols. Quirky yet meaningful, these imprints transform bread from mere food into something that carries story and identity. Children cluster near the oven, watching the baking process with rapt attention. One child steals a piece of dough and tucks it into her sleeve. The baker catches her but only smiles and tussles her hair. Even in a society built on strict rules and hierarchies, the simple joy of dough, flour, and warmth is universal. Bread is a teacher, a companion, and sometimes a mischievous delight. You notice that some loaves are prepared for the temple, round, smooth, and glazed with honey or sesame. They will be offered to gods in rituals that bind human life to divine favor. In these moments, bread takes on layers of meaning. It is sustenance, yes, but also a bridge between mortals and eternity. Priests will bless these loaves, placing them on altars, and in return, the people hope for protection, health, and good fortune. A curious detail captures your attention. Some loaves are intentionally shaped like animals, birds, fish, or even crocodiles. These were not meant for eating, but as symbolic offerings. Children might recognize them as toys or figures, but adults understood their ritual significance. Scholars still debate how widespread this practice was and whether it influenced later Egyptian art. But for now, you watch the tiny bread crocodiles lined neatly on a shelf, waiting to be carried to shrines or buried in tombs as spiritual sustenance for the dead. Back at the ovens, another baker pours water over the hot stones, creating a hiss and steam that curls into the air. This method ensures that the bread develops a crust that is crisp on the outside, yet soft and chewy inside. You watch as the loaves brown evenly, their aroma rising in waves. One baker taps a finished loaf and smiles. The sound is hollow, signaling it is done. You bite a small piece from the edge. The texture is perfect, the flavor robust, slightly smoky from the stone, earthy from the grain. It is simple, yet miraculous in its completeness. The rhythm of the bakery continues throughout the morning. Kneading, shaping, sliding loaves into ovens, removing them, allowing them to cool. Each step is essential, each movement deliberate. You begin to notice a pattern. Life itself is mirrored in this process. Measure, effort, transformation, patience, reward. Bread is life made tangible, made edible. Outside, the village hums with its own rhythm. Farmers head toward the fields, artisans to their workshops, children to errands or play. Yet the smell of baking bread threads through everything, connecting households, streets, and generations. Even as people scatter, the bakery remains a constant, a place of nourishment, community, and quiet magic. You pause to reflect on the many layers of bread in ancient Egypt. It sustains the body, serves as currency, functions as ritual, carries symbolic meaning, and even provides small joys for children. It connects mortals to gods, workers to the state, families to each other. Dense, humble, yet profound, it embodies the essence of daily life. As the morning sun climbs higher, you take one final deep breath, inhaling the faintly sweet, yeasty air. Bread, you realize, is not just food here. It is continuity, history, and humanity baked into every loaf. The ovens glow, the kneading hands move, the children watch and learn, and life carries on, simple and eternal. The afternoon sun drifts lazily over the horizon, casting long shadows across the granaries and streets of the village. You follow a narrow path toward the river, where farmers and bakers converge in quiet collaboration. The air carries the familiar scent of wheat, slightly sweet and earthy, mixed with the occasional tang of sourdough fermenting in clay pots. You pause to watch a group of women sifting grain, their hands moving in steady, repetitive motions, separating chaff from kernel. It's meditative work, rhythmic and almost hypnotic, each sift an echo of centuries of agricultural knowledge. Nearby, a young apprentice kneads dough with focused concentration. The muscles in his forearms flex with each fold and press, flour dusting his arms and clothes. The dough responds to his touch, stretching and springing back in a tactile dialogue. He shapes one loaf after another, each round and weighted with the promise of nourishment. You notice a faint smile on his face, as though he finds pleasure not just in sustenance, but in the act itself, in the tactile poetry of bread making. A mainstream historical fact comes to mind. Most Egyptian households relied heavily on bread as a staple, consuming multiple loaves daily. It was more than just a component of the meal. It formed the central sustenance around which every other food revolved. Families would ration portions carefully, ensuring children and elders received enough. And surplus loaves were often used for offerings or traded for small goods. Bread, in this sense, was a silent measure of survival and community cohesion. Your attention shifts to a table where a baker has just rolled dough into long, thin strands. He twists and braids them with deliberate care, creating intricate patterns that are both functional and decorative. Some scholars still argue whether these braided shapes held symbolic significance, representations of the Nile, fertility, or perhaps the continuity of life, or whether they were merely aesthetic flourishes intended to delight the eye as well as the stomach. Either way, the artistry is evident, a reminder that even simple food carries cultural weight. A quirky detail captures your gaze. A small pile of dough scraps sits nearby, carefully molded into miniature animals and tiny symbolic figures. These are not for eating, but for domestic rituals, personal talismans, or playful gestures for children. You watch a boy pick one up, a tiny loaf shaped like a cat, and examine it with wide-eyed curiosity before placing it gently back among the other figures. The act is intimate and human, linking the ordinary practice of baking with imagination and devotion. As you continue along the river path, you notice large sacks of emmer and barley stacked neatly on the banks, waiting to be ground into flour. Men carry them from boats and carts, placing them in the hands of women who begin the slow process of milling. The grinding stones rasp and churn, producing fine dust that floats lazily in the afternoon light. You inhale the aroma of fresh grain, mixed with the warmth of sun-baked stone, and it feels grounding, an olfactory tether to the labor that sustains the village. The process of bread making here is layered and communal. Bakers, millers, and farmers each contribute, their efforts intertwined. A loaf begins as seed sown in the Nile's fertile soil, grows through careful cultivation, is harvested, milled, kneaded, and finally baked over fire. You trace this journey in your mind, imagining the hands, time, and patience required at every step. Even a simple piece of bread represents an entire ecosystem of work, skill, and natural cycles. Nearby, a priest carries a small loaf toward a temple shrine, bowing slightly before placing it among other offerings. You notice that the bread is smooth, perhaps brushed with oil or honey, shaped with precision. It is clearly intended for the divine, distinguished from the coarser loaves consumed at home. This distinction illustrates the layered role of bread in ancient Egyptian society: sustenance for the living, gifts for the gods, symbols of devotion, and a medium of human connection. A light breeze carries the faint sounds of children playing along the riverbank. One child balances a loaf on his head, mimicking the adults, and laughter bursts out unexpectedly. A small dog darts past, snatching a crumb and eliciting delighted shouts. Even amidst labor and ritual, playfulness persists, proof that bread, simple as it is, bridges not just sustenance and ritual, but joy and community.
Quirky, almost humorous practices emerge as you observe further. Some bakers intentionally char the tops of loaves to produce burnt offerings for deities associated with the underworld. These overcooked loaves, intentionally roughened, were thought to be pleasing to gods who preferred fire-touched sustenance. Historians still debate the origin and significance of this practice, whether symbolic, superstitious, or merely pragmatic, but the interplay of caution and creativity fascinates you.
The sun tilts lower, softening the day. Bakers begin tending the ovens for evening loaves, carefully turning and monitoring the heat. Steam rises from the hot stones, carrying the scent of toasted grain across the village. The rhythm of life, grinding, kneading, shaping, baking, continues, a quiet yet persistent testament to human persistence and ingenuity. Bread sustains the body, yes, but also the community, the culture, and the rituals that define existence. You pause to watch a woman remove a tray of baked loaves from the oven. The crust is golden, lightly blistered, and perfect. She carries them to a shaded area to cool, where children gather to receive small pieces, their hands sticky with flour and crumbs. Even in these moments of play, the labor behind each loaf is honored and appreciated. Bread is both work and reward, a tangible expression of care and continuity. As evening approaches, the river reflects the deepening colors of the sky. The village hums with quiet activity. Families gather for their meals. Ovens cool, and the last loaves are distributed or set aside for the morning. You take a deep breath, inhaling the mingled scents of grain, earth, and warmth, feeling a sense of connection across time. Bread is ordinary, yet through its making and sharing, it carries the extraordinary, the rhythm of life, devotion, and humanity baked into every crumb. The evening air grows cooler as you wander toward the outskirts of the village, where fields meet the edge of the desert, and the Nile's gentle flow whispers against the banks. You notice a group of bakers sitting around the last embers of a communal oven, talking quietly while finishing the day's remaining loaves. Their movements are slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial, scraping dough remnants from bowls, dusting flour from work surfaces, stacking loaves to cool. There's a sense of closure in the rhythm, a quiet acknowledgement that the day has ended and all the effort has produced sustenance for body and spirit alike. You follow a baker as he walks toward the granaries, carrying a small tray of bread. He places the loaves carefully inside, arranging them in neat rows. Each one bears faint marks, fingerprints, scoring, stamps that tell their story. Some will be eaten within hours, others stored for later, and a few may even travel to temples as offerings. Bread is not merely food. It is a vessel of continuity, a tangible link between daily labor and spiritual practice. A mainstream historical fact surfaces: bread and beer were the cornerstone of Egyptian labor rations. Farmers, artisans, and builders of tombs received these staples daily, providing both energy and nourishment for long hours of toil. Payment in grain-based foods was practical. Metal coins were rare, and the economy of ancient Egypt relied heavily on goods rather than currency. Each loaf you see stacked in the granary represents hours of cultivation, milling, and baking, evidence of a sophisticated and enduring system of provisioning. Quirky details persist amidst the ordinary. You notice a small loaf with a series of tiny holes poked across its surface. The baker explains that these perforations prevent uneven cooking, allowing steam to escape. Some families even made playful designs: stars, animals, or hieroglyph-like symbols, turning practical measures into subtle artistry. Scholars still argue about how widespread these decorative practices were, but observing the care with which each loaf is treated suggests that aesthetics and utility coexisted comfortably in daily life. You wander to a nearby field where a few families are still working to harvest late crops of wheat. Children chase each other through the golden stalks, occasionally pausing to nibble on kernels or help their parents carry small bundles. The connection between field and table becomes tangible here. Every loaf begins as a seed sown in fertile soil, nurtured by hands that will one day knead it into bread. The cycle of growth, labor, and sustenance is immediate and tangible, and you feel it in the rhythm of your own breathing as you watch. Nearby, a woman rinses her hands in a shallow basin of Nile water, leaving them sticky with flour. She laughs softly, flicking a sprinkle toward her daughter, who squeals and retreats. Their domestic life is intertwined with the production of bread, shaping dough, managing ovens, rationing grain, sharing with neighbors, and offering to the gods. Bread here is not isolated. It is embedded in every aspect of daily routine, from childhood games to spiritual devotion. The oven glows faintly in the dusk, still warm from the day's labor. One baker slides in a fresh batch of dough, kneading lightly and brushing with a touch of oil. The aroma rises instantly, mingling with the earthy scent of drying grain and the faint tang of fermented dough. You inhale deeply, feeling a comforting sense of continuity, a link to countless Egyptians who have experienced this same warmth and fragrance. Even now, as night approaches, the oven works quietly, its steady heat a reminder that labor and patience yield sustenance. A child tugs at a baker's sleeve, asking for a small loaf. The baker kneels, breaking off a piece and placing it in the child's hands. You notice the deliberate pacing of this interaction: care, attention, and ritual. Bread is not handed over casually. It is shared with recognition of its value and significance. In the same moment, you realize that bread in ancient Egypt served multiple purposes simultaneously: nourishment, pedagogy, and cultural continuity. Quirky stories flowed into your awareness. Some bakers left small offerings of dough atop their ovens, believing it would bring good fortune or appease household spirits. Others shaped loaves into miniature figurines representing gods or ancestors. You see faint traces of this practice even today, subtle enough to go unnoticed by those unfamiliar with the ritual. Historians still debate how much these practices influenced official religious ceremonies versus domestic superstition, but the overlap is undeniable. Bread operated as both food and symbol, crossing boundaries between material and spiritual life. As night deepens, the village settles into quiet. Families retreat to their homes. Children yawn and stretch, and the distant ripple of the Nile forms a soft background hum. The remaining bakers tidy their workspace, stack the last loaves for storage, and extinguish small lamps. The smell of baking lingers faintly, a gentle reminder that even as the day ends, the labor and love embedded in bread persist. You pause to savor the quiet, letting the rhythm of daily life, the continuity of grain and dough, and the scent of warm bread settle over you. You consider the layers of meaning in this simple staple: sustenance, labor, ritual, art, connection, and memory. Bread embodies survival, community, and culture simultaneously. Each loaf carries fingerprints, stories, and the essence of those who prepared it, binding generations together. As you watch the final baker leave the oven and the granaries, you feel a sense of reverent calm, the hum of human continuity, the echo of ordinary lives elevated through care, rhythm, and devotion. The desert wind carries the faint scent of yeast and baked grain, blending with the night air. Stars emerge above, twinkling over the Nile and across rooftops. You breathe in deeply, aware that this humble food, dense, chewy, and earthy, is more than nourishment. It is history, artistry, and connection, a silent thread linking past to present, life to labor, and human to divine. Night drapes itself softly over the village, and the last flicker of lamps fades against the clay walls. The ovens have cooled, the kneading bowls are stacked, and the faint aroma of baked bread lingers in the still air like a gentle memory. You stroll through the quiet streets, noticing the shadows stretching across courtyards and riverbanks, the soft hum of the Nile in the distance. Life has slowed to a peaceful rhythm, and the sense of daily continuity is almost tangible. Each loaf baked, each grain milled, each drop of beer poured. Everything has played its role in sustaining human life, weaving ordinary acts into the fabric of centuries. You pause near a small home where a family has gathered to break their evening bread. They sit cross-legged, loaves resting on a simple mat, dipping pieces into lentils and honey, sipping beer from a shared jug. The warm, golden light of an oil lamp illuminates their faces, and the simplicity of the scene feels sacred. You recognize a pattern repeated countless times across ancient Egypt: bread as nourishment, bread as ritual, bread as a silent testament to human patience and care. Even in its ordinary form, bread carries layers of meaning, connection, sustenance, and subtle artistry. A mainstream fact surfaces. Bread in ancient Egypt was often stamped with symbols or hieroglyphs, identifying the baker, the grain, or the intended consumer. Some loaves were distributed as rations, others offered to gods, and a few stored for later use. This system, precise yet intimate, reveals a society organized around the most basic yet essential human need: food. The markings on each loaf are a small but significant record, an ancient signature preserved in flour and fire. Quirky details catch your eye as you wander. On a nearby table, tiny dough figurines shaped like animals and gods await ritual placement. Children play with small scraps, pressing them into whimsical forms. Some loaves bear unusual designs: stars, lotus blossoms, or miniature footprints, suggesting symbolic meaning, playful imagination, or perhaps a combination of both. Historians still debate the precise intent behind these decorative practices, but the overlap of practicality, ritual, and creativity is unmistakable. Bread was never simply bread. It was survival, art, teaching, and devotion, all rolled into one dense, fragrant package. You walk along the riverbank, the cool air carrying a faint aroma of yeast and stone-heated bread. Fishermen pause to share a small loaf, dipping it into a jug of beer before continuing their work. Women returning from fields carry baskets of cooled loaves, distributing them among family and neighbors. The rhythm of life, the grind of wheat, the shaping of dough, the heat of ovens, the sharing of food, continues quietly, invisible yet vital. You recognize the enduring human patterns embedded in these acts: labor, patience, creativity, and care. Nearby, a baker slides a loaf from the final oven of the day, its crust golden brown, lightly blistered, and still warm to the touch. He breaks a piece and offers it to a passing child, who accepts it with a soft laugh and a grateful smile. You note the deliberate, almost reverential care with which each loaf is handled. Bread here is both sustenance and ritual. A simple piece carries the weight of community, history, and continuity. The night deepens, stars emerging above the Nile, reflecting in the calm water. The village is quiet now, with only the occasional murmur of families settling in for rest. The ovens sit dormant, yet the scent of baked grain remains, clinging softly to the night air. Bread, in all its forms, has fulfilled its role today, feeding, sustaining, and connecting lives across the village. Even the tiniest scraps left for children, animals, or household spirits reflect the care, creativity, and continuity that define daily life. A mainstream observation comes to mind. Bread and beer were more than mere nutrition. They were the lifeblood of society. They enabled labor, ritual, and social cohesion. Every loaf, no matter how humble, represented the careful orchestration of agriculture, preparation, and sharing, from field to oven to table. It is remarkable to consider how these basic foods shaped not only bodies, but also the very structure of civilization. You notice a family placing a final loaf on a small altar, perhaps as an offering to a household deity or a protective spirit. The gesture is subtle yet intimate, blending daily routine with reverence. Scholars still debate whether such domestic practices were primarily symbolic or if they carry deeper ritual significance. But the act itself speaks volumes about the human need to connect the tangible and spiritual, the practical and the sacred. You sit quietly on a low stone, letting the soft nocturnal hum of the village wash over you. The distant rippling of the river, the gentle rustle of palm leaves, and the faint scent of yeast combine into a lullaby of ordinary life. Bread, dense, humble, fragrant, has woven itself into every layer of human existence: sustenance, ritual, artistry, and joy. Each loaf is a story, a document of continuity, and a tangible link between the past and the present. Slowly, the village slips fully into night. You take a deep breath, inhaling the warmth, the aroma, and the quiet rhythm of life. The ovens are still, the granaries stocked, families resting, and the soft hum of continuity carries on. Bread, in its ordinary resilience, has held the day together, connecting labor, creativity, devotion, and simple human joy. As you rise to leave, the stars twinkle over the Nile, mirrored in the gentle reflection of river waters. You feel the enduring presence of countless hands that have kneaded, shaped, baked, and shared. The scent of fresh loaves and the warmth of stone ovens linger in your senses, a gentle, grounding memory. Bread, in all its forms, has been more than sustenance. It has been history, culture, and quiet continuity baked into the fabric of everyday life. Now, as the night settles completely, you feel a calm wash over you. The soft echoes of the village, the lingering aromas, and the enduring rhythm of bread making create a lullaby for the senses. You recognize the beauty in the ordinary, the sacredness in sustenance, and the deep, unbroken thread that links human generations through flour, water, and fire. Slowly, your breath matches the gentle pulse of the village. The world is at peace. The ovens have cooled, the loaves are shared, and the night whispers softly, carrying the promise of another day, another cycle, and another chance to knead, shape, and share. Sweet dreams,